All right. Hello and welcome to the first event in the Open Society University Network 2020 U.S. Election Series. This is a series of virtual dialogues which are going to focus on the stakes and core issues of the 2020 U.S. election. I hope the series is going to provide insight into both campaigns' perspectives and the potential consequences, particularly for our foreign policy, of either outcome. My name is Walter Russell Mead. Some of you know me as a professor at Bard, and I'm the Global View columnist for the Wall Street Journal. Today, it's my pleasure, and I can say my honor, to introduce Dr. Kiron Skinner, who joins me to discuss what a second Trump administration might mean for U.S. foreign policy. Dr. Skinner is an expert in U.S. foreign policy, national security, and political strategy. She's had a distinguished career in academia and government service. Dr. Skinner is the Tobe Professor at Carnegie Mellon University and Director of the Center for International Relations and Policy of the Carnegie Mellon University Washington Semester Program, the Institute for Politics and Strategy, and the Institute for Strategic Analysis. I hope I've got them all there. You have a longer list of titles than I do, Dr. Skinner.
But I don't have more publications, so how's that?
All right, that's because you're busy achieving things while I just scribble. Anyway, Dr. Skinner previously served as Director for Policy Planning and Senior Advisor to the Secretary of State. Her past government service includes membership on the U.S. Defense Department's Policy Review Board as an advisor on the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, the Chief of Naval Operations Executive Panel, the National Academy's Committee on Behavioral and Social Science Research to improve intelligence analysis for national security, and the National Security Education Board. In 2010, Dr. Skinner was appointed to the advisory board of the George W. Bush Oral History Project. From 2012 to 2015, Professor Skinner served on Pennsylvania Governor Tom Gorbat's Advisory Commission on African American Affairs. She served as a foreign policy surrogate for the Bush-Cheney 2004 re-election campaign, a senior foreign policy advisor to Speaker Newt Gingrich during his presidential campaign in 2011-2012, a foreign policy surrogate during the final stretch of Governor Mitt Romney's 2012 presidential campaign, and a foreign policy advisor to Senator Rand Paul during his presidential bid in 2015-2016. Dr. Skinner, thank you for joining me today. It's really good to see you again, even if it's just virtually. And I'd like to kick it off with a kind of a broad question. As somebody who's been in and out of government during this last administration, what is your evaluation of Donald Trump's foreign policy track record? What are some of the key successes and failures of American foreign policy on his watch that you would point to?
That's a huge question, but let me begin by thanking you, Professor Walter Russell Mead, for having me join you. And the next time we do an event, you'll do a 2-line bio for me, or we won't be doing it, because your bio is so impressive and the work that you do is so important that I want to use all of the time to engage with the community that you've curated through the various activities that you do. What I so appreciate about your work is that you're open to all points of view, and you find a way of being remarkably apolitical in a very political time, and I'll talk about that today. And also that you care so much about young people. I hope you don't mind that I tell this global audience that I had the honor of being a guest at your amazing Washington home that's filled with books, which is rare nowadays, and to discuss a book that a colleague of mine from Harvard had written. And it reminded me of the old salon dinners that used to take place across the aisle in Washington. And now it's almost impossible to do such an event. So you're one of the few left. I don't know if that means you're a relic, but it does mean that you're relevant. On to this hard question about the Trump administration, successes and failures. I'll start with what I think are successes, and I think we've got to kind of define success and failure. And the way that I think we can do that is about getting to an outcome that wasn't perhaps anticipated, that's very, very difficult, that changes the game in some arena in the broad international relations space. If we use that as our metric, I think there have been a number of successes, especially in the last few months in 2020, that should be noted. And the way that I can get to that answer is to briefly define what I think is the Trump Doctrine, and that will help me then address this matter of success and failure in foreign policy at this time. The Trump the Trump doctrine, and I do believe there is one, and I know that in some corners that's heresy, but it is a different way in the 21st century of looking at the international system. It's premised on the view that the many of the ideas, the institutions, the structures, and even the people that guided us through the later part of the 20th century and into the new century just aren't relevant anymore because the international system itself has been evolving. And it's been evolving in a way that won't look like post World War II America. The actors will be different. The position of the United States is already different. And if the United States doesn't catch up to the fast evolving system, it will be less important, not completely irrelevant, but definitely not a predominant actor on the international stage. In other words, the Trump doctrine is an attempt to give the United States a major course correction so that it, one, remains a predominant actor on the international stage, two, that it buys the US and the world, or the West in particular, a generation two of freedom, and that it opens the door for economic growth and freedom of the seas. That's what it's attempting to achieve. And it's saying we are important in terms of what we're trying to do in this administration because, first of all, we've problem identified better than some of our predecessors. What am I talking about? The fact that the United States no longer controls the lion's share of global GDP the way that it did after World War II, and many later in the 20th century and even in this new century didn't really recognize that you've got to revise your economic, your political economy programs to the reality of where we are. Everyone now seems to agree that China is a quote unquote problem, but that's not really what the Trump administration is trying to say. It is trying to say we want to make China a more responsible actor on the international stage and play within the rules that have been set up as far back as the Atlantic Charter in 1941. It's also a recognition, though it's been given less credit for this, that there's a coming power of the global South, a set of nations that aren't necessarily just the BRICS that will define the future. We need relations with them. It's also that our longstanding allies and partners, of whom we have cultural affinity that we fought wars with, like the NATO countries, have to do more for mutual defense. It's premised on the idea that there has to be greater reciprocity in international agreements, or those agreements should not take place at all. It's premised on the belief that multilateralism does matter, but not multilateralism for the sake of it. And that in that context of multilateralism, it shouldn't be confused with international engagement, that sometimes the best international engagement may be bilateral, and you may get better agreements that way, that are more transparent, that are more reciprocal just by the fact that there are fewer people at the big conference table making the decisions, and that perhaps the final agreement is not 2,000 pages. It is premised on the belief that the nation state is the core unit of analysis in the international system. Not that the nation state is the best that's ever happened for the world, but at this time in world history, it is superior to international organizations, to regional arrangements, in protecting people, in enhancing economic growth, in making prosperity and opportunity happen, and that a return to the nation state as the core unit, not the only unit, but the core unit in the international system, will help clarify where the world is. Within that nation state focus, this idea of the national interests should matter most for states, and that if they advance through, in their international engagements through the perspective of the national interests, in fact, they will get better agreements and outcomes. There's nothing wrong with caring about your political and territorial integrity. That, in a broad way, is the Trump Doctrine. The way that I talked about it in a number of speeches when I was director of the Office of Policy Planning. Has it achieved some of the objectives that the various pillars and premises outlined? Perhaps. Are there problems with it? Absolutely. And will it go away if there is a Biden administration? Probably not. So let me speak to those. In terms of some of the successes, I would say, and this is one that is highly, I think, unanticipated for some of the most deeply involved foreign policy experts in our nation and throughout the world, is that we could turn this idea of getting peace deals in the broader Middle East on its head. For decades, we approached the idea through the fault lines in the Middle East. One, the issue of the two-state solution. That there had to be a two-state solution before you could get to normalization with Israel of any country in the Middle East outside of Egypt and Jordan, which had already signed agreements with Israel. That instead of trying to get the ultimate peace agreement where you stand up and show that you've done something in a big Rose Garden meeting, that you do something else, that you start with an economic agreement and you work on other aspects of the broader problem between Israel and its neighbors. And that ultimately will get you to normalization. Not many people thought that was possible. You had to go for the Oslo Accord, something really big, before you could move the needle. We've seen in the last couple of months some big agreements happen around normalization between Israel and Gulf states. And it's largely due to the fact that there was a major economic agreement put forth by Jared Kushner and his team, actually not the State Department, but a small group in the White House, thinking if we work on what's already been happening in the last decade or so in the Middle East, is that Israel and the Gulf states, many of whom did not participate in the wars decades ago against Israel, have a lot in common, are quietly working together on intelligence, on financial dealings. Let's help make that possible very explicitly. And as it became clear that that was the reality, normalization became possible. That doesn't block the idea of a two-state solution in the future. The view in this new thinking is that it may enhance it because more countries are coming together with Israel. And the Palestinian issue, as important as it is, indeed it is important, has a broader context in which to operate. So that's very significant success. The normalization of relations between Israel and Bahrain, between Israel and UAE, and a host of other countries perhaps coming on board, maybe even before this year is over, perhaps one or two before the election. I don't know. But that's really, I think, a different way of looking at the international system, that there are a set of countries in the Arab world, in the Muslim world, that really don't have to wait until there is a final decision around the Palestinians to begin to do publicly or overtly what they've already been doing with that country. Another success related to that is Kosovo and Serbia. I don't think anyone thought in recent months that there could be any kind of deal between Kosovo and Serbia. And in fact, our envoy, Ambassador Rick Grinnell, who now works for me at Carnegie Mellon on a fellowship, was instrumental as the envoy in the brokering an economic deal, not a peace agreement, between the two parties as the foundation for getting a peace agreement later. But along the way, using the Jared Kushner innovated model, um, having one country recognize Israel and the other or both making the decision to have their embassies or offices moved to Jerusalem. That was unexpected. It's a huge success because it begins the process of settling a major European dispute for which no one has had an easy answer. That's the same in the Middle East. These are big outcomes for the administration. A third one, Walter, that I would mention to the audience is the fact that whether you like Trump or not, whether you like his rhetoric or the way he goes about things, he has played a role in building a bipartisan consensus around China as a problem for the United States and the West in terms of fair dealing. And that's not in dispute now. And we weren't quite there when he assumed the Oval Office in January 2017. And because we have more of a bipartisan understanding of China as a problem, I think we can get to some better policies and solutions. Now, I could talk about more, but let me talk about some failures. I think, and I've said this as a government official, and in a talk, I think at the Atlantic Council to a private group, and at the end of it, someone there who was chairing the meeting, and I don't want to reveal it in this form, though he may not mind, said to me, and he'd held a very high level government position in a prior administration. I've never heard someone while in government talk about the problems of the very doctrine that they're supposed to be working on. And I said, well, I'm in a unique role because I'm the director of the Office of Policy Planning. And my job, as Richard Haas described it to me, someone who's had it before, is always to give a second opinion. And so we have this idea of sovereignty, national interest. The nation state is a core pillar of the Trump Doctrine. We have this idea of burden sharing with our allies as a pillar. I didn't so much mention regional partnerships, but new arrangements, not NATO-like, but ones in the Indo-Pacific that are emerging. All of these pillars, reciprocity and agreements, great ideas. But in detail and in reality, they're all problematic. And that's where I think the quote unquote failure has been, is that the president has had some interesting hunches and instincts, but the failure so far has been that no one in the foreign policy part of this administration has turned his hunches and instincts into hypotheses. That's what I was attempting to do. I didn't survive in the administration long enough to actually do it, but I believe that our president is smart enough and quick enough and open enough to doing some intellectual course corrections if people come to him with hypotheses that have grounded his hunches in ways that he would not have anticipated. I think instead, many of his advisors do something else. They say, okay, sir, you want to get out of Afghanistan. That's not possible. Here are the reasons why. That's actually not doing rival hypothesizing or necessarily analytical thinking. It's just taking one's priors and trying to make the president go in a particular direction. In the United States, and in every country that has free and fair and frequent elections. Elections have consequences. And it is the responsibility of those who serve a president to really take him or her seriously and try to scientifically look at what they're attempting to do. And I believe that the battle of an election really makes one prepared for the kind of analytical work that I'm thinking about. But many advisors think they're smarter than the person who got elected, and they don't need to do the hard work. I'll stop there.
That's very helpful. So you mentioned some successes: the Bosnia-Kosovo agreement, the normalization agreements with the Gulf states and Israel. Maybe some more to come. Would there be any other places where you've seen the administration being able to chalk up some significant foreign policy success?
I think a couple of other things. The Indo-Pacific strategy that General McMaster was attempting to work on and took us pretty far in that process has been a huge win for this administration because it's refocused our attention on that part of the world as the next key, potential battleground. And so I think if I think the big win of HR's tenure as National Security Advisor. And my big disappointment is that we haven't gotten far beyond where he was trying to take us back in 2017 and 2018. And so this idea that we've got to have regional partners in that, and the Quad, for example, the way that it has been working, US, India, Australia, Japan, at every level, from foreign ministers, at my level, when I was in government, at the assistant secretary level, this idea that we've got to work together, but we don't have to build a big office building and put it in Brussels. We can surge together, we can plan together. I think that is something this administration deserves credit for. And it's been really important. Also, and I haven't mentioned, the whole idea of pulling out of Middle East wars and trying to say, we'll support you, but we won't be the driver of what you do, that we can't nation build, that we can't fix your societies, and we can't ultimately win your wars, has been a major theme of this administration, and it's actually happened. I know it's a touchy issue about Afghanistan and Iraq and Syria, but we're beginning to be less present on the ground, boots on the ground. And for many Americans, that's actually a positive. I'm a voter in Western PA, and in the part of the country in the Great Lakes region, the big Midwest, where many people are questioning our 20-year involvement in kinetic activity in that part of the world.
Mm-hmm. So what do you think the priorities of a second term in foreign policy for President Trump would look like?
I think there are going to be a couple of buckets, and this may surprise you a bit because you think in grand strategic terms, and I'm beginning to, having served in government, realize that grand strategy, and this is something, Walter, you probably already know, but if you do get to serve in government at some point, and I probably will insist you do, that the biggest grand strategy is all about the personnel and people. And you can have the best ideas, but if you don't have the best people who are committed to those ideas and who are willing to really go to battle with the establishment from which they come, you don't get grand strategy. If you remember, and you'll know this both from life and from your work, that there was no bigger enemy of much of the establishment in the mid 70s, late 70s, than Henry Kissinger. And in the 76 presidential campaign, many at the Republican convention, um, that hot summer in Kansas City said their theme was fire Henry Kissinger. And that was because he was thinking differently than many had wanted him to think about foreign policy. Détente for many was a bad idea. I think we're in a much more contested period around ideas. And a second Trump term, I think, will have more people who are willing to go to battle on ideas with the establishment, with their very best friends. I don't know if you mentioned in the intro of me, but I'm a long-term fellow at the Hoover Institution, and more recently at the Heritage Foundation as a visiting fellow. And it's been interesting because I have, I'm a life member of CFR. I'm a life director for the Atlantic Council. I'm a life member for the Pacific Council. But I disagree with a lot of my friends, and a lot of them disagree with me. But I think we're still friends. I'm not sure that I'm invited to the cocktail parties. Walter let me know if I'm not on the list anymore. But I think it's going to be about getting the right people. And some of those people who are skeptics right now, I think are going to be needed in a second Trump term if they're willing to roll up their sleeves and do the work. So the first issue for me in a second Trump term, and I think this is starting to happen now because of the new White House presidential personnel office and system they've put in place, that's going a bit deep into the Washington weeds, but I think it's going to be about replacing the Trump resistors with those who want to turn the president's hunches and instincts into hypotheses. And I think some of that's starting to happen now.
Okay, let me just tell our participants that there is a Q&A button you can send in to ask questions, and I'll be able to see it. So can look for questions to ask our guest. But I've still got a few more. So what you say is the second Trump term may see an intensification of the sort of struggle between Trump and the establishment. Can you tell us a little bit more concretely about what are the issues where you think there really would be an even tougher Washington struggle than we've seen in the last 4 years?
Yeah, I'm not sure it will be tougher. I think it will be different, because I think what will start to happen is that people will settle down in a second Trump term. I think the idea in the first Trump term was resist, put some never Trumpers in key places, hold your nose, this guy will be out soon, we'll be back in JCPOA, we'll be back in TPP, we'll be back in the Paris Climate Accord. I think in a second term, people will say, okay, now we have to get an Iran policy. If you ask me about failures, and I did mention this, but I do think one of them is that we never really got an Iran policy. Sanctioning people and entities over and over again is not a policy. Claiming that you've cut off their ability to ship oil all over the world is not a policy, because the Iranians have proven they can live another day. And they do live another day. And there's no way to cut off all the oil engagements. We can't even see all that's being done. But I think in a second term that there will be a bringing down of the temperature, and that people will say, okay, there have been some successes. These are objective. For Thomas Friedman to say the UAE-Israel deal was an earthquake. For many others like him who have been beyond Trump skeptics to say this is critical. Dennis Ross, John Hanna, a range of people. I think we will get to work. Mm-hmm. And instead of the acrimony and the fighting and the backbiting and the attempt to reverse what the direction the president's going, I think people will say, now let's give shape to it. Mm-hmm. Let's add history and context. And let's build back relationships that were really hurt both internally and abroad during the first 4 years. I don't know if that's still too theoretical, but that's what I believe.
Hmm. Well, I suppose the relationship that people would say came under the most stress was the U.S.-Germany relationship in Trump's first term. How do you think in a second term the Trump people would handle that differently, or would there be different results? Where do you see that relationship going in a second term?
I know that the German one is put to the test a lot, or it's referenced a lot as here's an example of, where we have not done well with a key European ally. I think some of that too depends on who you talk to. Germans are putting a lot more into mutual defense. Those were hard conversations. I don't know if there was any easy way to do what has been done with NATO. I know I probably would not have been the best diplomat for that role. Rick Brunel seemed to have walked right into it and understood what the president wanted and was willing to push for it. Not many ambassadors could do what he did. I think we'll see um, more mutual defense spending by Germany and the NATO countries in a second Trump term. When you're trying to do something of that enormity, there have been hundreds of millions of dollars, additional dollars in the last couple of years into NATO spending than before Trump took office. When you're trying to do something like that, I don't know if there's a diplomacy handbook that will make it happen. The NATO Secretary General has on numerous occasions thanked Trump for helping to make his job more efficient, easier, and I think that matters. So I think U.S. Germany, we're tied culturally, we're tied over the centuries, and we will continue to be close allies. But sometimes the fights in the family are the hardest. This was like being at the Thanksgiving table during COVID-19 with the family. That's what it was like.
Okay. I have a question here from one of our participants. How does the state of our democracy fare if the point of the bureaucracy or the personnel of our country is about getting rid of resistors to presidential power? Does this allow partisan politics into a fundamentally nonpartisan part of the government? So is the fight against the Trump resistors inside the bureaucracy, is that really partisanizing the nonpartisan bureaucratic civil service?
So let me answer this in a bit of a different way. And if the person asking the question wants to come back, feel free. I don't think that the issue facing this administration has been the resistors within the government, the civil servants. I don't like to call them bureaucrats, but um, I think that people think there is a deep state that's been resisting the president. When I talk about resistance, I think it's been more the political appointees and the political class itself. I think, and what I witnessed at the quote unquote revolution was that there are some fabulous civil servants who are willing to put politics aside, but were never really given the opportunity to do so. And I know this is very different, a different analysis than what you hear coming out of the Trump camp from many people, but some of those people didn't serve too in the administration. When a new president comes in, usually there is a dance between the career officials and the political appointees. That goes on for 6 months or so, then it's over for the most part. And they start working together. But there wasn't really that opportunity for the most part in this administration because the political appointees were at war. The never Trump versus the pro Trump. Maybe it was the conservatives against the less conservatives, but however we name them, they've been in a battle and it hasn't really ended. And I think that's part of what's been going on at the State Department, frankly, and DOD. And we can ill afford to have political appointees who are so divided. That then didn't give that the opportunity for the normal dance between the politicals and careers. And that, I think, has been a key tension, that we never had that opportunity. I think in the second term, we'll see that, and the resistance will, however it forms, will be less. So one part of it is the political appointees who have been resisting. A second part has been transnational and bipartisan. And I say that in the sense that both of those groups have come together and have tried to talk to their contacts within government, within the civil service, and with the political appointees, and instructed them just resist. And we'll be back in COA as soon as possible. I saw that as a government official taking place, and I thought it was undemocratic, but it was. I think there will be less of that in a second term because bipartisan elites, conservative elites, and transnational actors will realize, okay, this guy's going to be here for 8 years. We better roll up our sleeves and get to work.
Just for some of our international student observers, I should say that one difference between the U.S. system and some other systems around the world is that in many countries, when you have a change of government, you don't make many changes in, say, the foreign ministry or the defense ministry. You change maybe the person at the top and a couple of others. In the U.S., we actually have thousands of political appointees in these different branches. Some of them have to be confirmed by the Senate, but many don't. And so every time the presidency turns over in the United States, there's a big wave of new people coming into government. Now, we also have career civil servants, many of whom rise very high in these institutions. So Dr. Skinner is saying that that a second Trump term, which I think is responsive to our question, isn't going to be about trying so much to purge the bureaucracy, the permanent civil servants, but to try to have among the political appointees people who are, as she would see it, more in touch with the thinking of the president. Is that a fair?
That's absolutely the case. And thanks for that clarification, because our system is different than many others. And we do have this, wave of thousands of people who come in who are politically appointed, who hold really high positions. But then at the same time, we have career officials who become key ambassadors, and they hold high positions. So there is this tendency to believe it's politicals versus careers. And often maybe it is, but in this case, I think it's the confusion and dissension among the political appointees that's been driving what's been happening. And very few people have written about this. The narrative has been that the political appointees have come in on a political jihad and just run over the careers. I think there are pockets of something like that, but I've seen very little of it.
Okay. We have another question here from a participant. How do you think what's happening domestically, particularly President Trump's questioning the democratic process in terms of the probity of elections and his recent failure in the debate to denounce white nationalist groups will impact the second term Trump foreign policy, or will it not matter?
It all matters. And if I had my wish, and if I could be king or queen for a day, I would just ask the presidential candidates to focus on the substance of what they're doing, because the debates are an opportunity for us to hear them in real time, under pressure, talk about the policies that will affect our daily lives. And so I hope that we'll have more of that in the second term. Our system is really hard, and I think that's what we saw on the debate stage, and that's what we've been seeing in the United States very publicly since George Floyd's murder. We are the world's most fully functioning multi-ethnic democracy. We're not the largest, that's India, but we are um, pretty mature. And with that comes a level of advanced citizenship that some are able to reach and others don't understand. And that's what's, I think, the subtext of 2020. This is what it's going to look like. We're going to be in contest as we make some big decisions around problems that we haven't really taken on in the way that we should have. And this is why I think the elites, and it's not that I'm just attacking my friends, but the elites are in trouble because they helped make Donald Trump possible. Had they been addressing the problems in our country in the last couple of decades, he may not have had a chance in 2016. Had Hillary Clinton campaigned in Moon Township instead of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, it may have been a different outcome. It was Donald Trump who campaigned in those parts of the country that no elite thought was even a battleground territory. And then he found that many of the white ethnics in rural America had very similar problems to people of color in the urban communities. And he began to talk to them in very serious terms. And that's part of the reason they voted for him. Has he gotten it all right? No. Should he have denounced white supremacists in a declarative statement? That would have been helpful. But does that disqualify him from being president of the United States? I don't think that we can make that judgment because there's so much blame on all sides for where we are as a nation right now. You could say the Democrats have done just as poor a job in the rhetoric, but also the reality of public policy, given that they have controlled the big city machines throughout this country where many of people of color, especially African Americans, live. And over 50 years, they've made very little progress. So I think there's just a huge problem in this country around race and rights and justice, and no political party and no conservative or liberal group has actually gotten it right. It's extremely difficult and it's really hard.
From your perspective, do you think the president is pushing the idea that the election might be rigged or flawed? And is that damaging to the United States when seen overseas?
I think both sides or all sides have been talking about voter fraud and about, so it's not Trump alone. He has a bigger bully pulpit because he is the president, but he's not alone in having that conversation. What does it do to perceptions overseas? I think it just shows those overseas, especially other democracies that are on the march to a truly more democratic and representative system, what it's going to look like. This entails a level of concentration and engagement constantly. Democracy is a very difficult form of government because for it to work, you're continually enfranchising more people. There are so many more points of social pressure. You know, Walter, 50 or 60 years ago, that it was so much easier to influence a member of Congress than it is today, because it's hard for them to even know who to listen to. And people are showing up with big buckets of money who didn't have money before. And so political money is very different as well. I think our system is going to mean a level of creative engagement and political entrepreneurship and innovation that we just haven't been prepared for. And I don't even know how to teach my students, frankly, to get ready for what they're about to face and take over. But I know it's exciting, and I know that there isn't a superior form of government to the one that we're trying to get to.
When you think about a possible Biden administration and a possible Trump administration over the next 4 years, what part of that difference worries you the most? In the sense of, what do you think would be the worst thing about a Biden foreign policy versus a Trump foreign policy?
What worries me most, and I've given some thought to this, is that the immediate impulse of the new Biden team will be to undo what has been done. And I think that there will be a level of disruption in our system if you just immediately undo. And so that's what I worry about. The first act of government for Trump was not to pull out of the Iran nuclear deal. That came after some time. I think we could be back in it, within 30 days. We could be back in the Paris Climate Accord. Let's slow down and understand, was there some logic to any of this? Have there been some good outcomes? Is the US-Mexico-Canada agreement superior to NAFTA? I think that's what I worry about, this undoing. And if we keep swinging back and forth and undoing from one administration to the next based on political party and political and partisan scoring, I just think we lose so much credibility with our international partners because we can't be trusted to stick in anything. And that is something that I think we've got to figure out a way to fix in our system. Now, that may mean ratifying everything through the Senate, which means that we go slower on everything, and then it's harder to undo. But if there are a whole new set of EOs, executive orders, that come down in the first quarter of a Biden administration, I'll be worried about the international effects of them.
Mm-hmm. I know when I listen to people in the Biden campaign, they talk about a goal of being a return to normal.
Mm-hmm.
If we have a Biden administration, do you think that's possible, or do you think it's desirable? Would a Biden administration look like a return to the old normal?
That's another, I think, flawed way of looking at it. I get the rhetoric, and I get the sentiment, and everyone wants a better day, and everyone remembers when things were easier. But the way I motivated this conversation was really to talk about the new world that we're in. There isn't a return to normalcy, or to a return to normal. It's just, the world is different. And it was different more than 20 years ago. It was different when the Cold War ended. New actors were emerging. There wasn't the kind of peace dividend that we thought existed. And so I think trying to return to what we used to do and the ways that we used to do them is a recipe for failure. We have different countries that will help lead and guide the international system that we barely have relationships with now. We have, a set of actors in our own country that should be running foreign policy who don't have a seat at the table in either party right now. What normal are we going to return to? A foreign policy dominated by white males with an occasional person of color at the table, many of whom claim to be China experts, but don't speak Chinese, don't know the culture. Maybe they've been safely in Hong Kong at some point, and now they're going to write the future. I don't think that's not, we've done that before. We can't do it in the future.
Who are some of the countries internationally who you said who will be making the new future, who hardly have a seat at the table, or we don't have much of a relationship with? What countries do you have in mind?
So when I talk about the coming power of the global South, and I think I was the only one at state to use that term, and for some reason the polls were using that term as well, I think we want to look at a set of nations that are going to be critical. India, I mean, Pakistan, Iran, Nigeria, Brazil. You could say, well, we have relations with those countries, but we haven't thought about them as global leaders. We haven't thought about what their demographic shifts and their resources, their natural resources, and their political maturity is going to mean for the system. So that's what I'm actually talking about. No one really has an Africa strategy. I haven't seen one in the 21st century. Why an Africa strategy is so important is that there is a political maturation going on that has shed the worst effects of the Cold War. During the Cold War, it was, a system where the countries figured out if they partnered with one or another side and spoke the rhetoric of, the communists are coming or we are Marxist ourselves, they would get resources and they could do it continually. And that was a Mobutu. They're not there now. They want something from China, they want something from Russia, they want something from us, and then they want to determine their future. We don't have the intellectual metrics and modalities for dealing with a continent like Africa with that kind of political sophistication.
An issue where there's been a lot of criticism of the Trump administration has been climate change. In a second Trump administration, what do you think American policy toward climate change would look like?
Well, we heard in the first debate there wasn't much foreign policy discussion, but Vice Presidential Democratic candidate Joe Biden talked about the rainforest in the Amazon and his desire to put together a group that would, deliver $20 billion to Brazil to stop the degrading the rainforest, and then perhaps slapping on economic sanctions if it doesn't do better. I don't know if that's the way. I don't think there's anyone on either side who would say the ecosystem of the rainforest globally aren't central to climate, and that they are unique and do something that is important for all of us. So I'm saying that to say I would hope in a second Trump term, and this is something I would insist on if I joined a second Trump term, that we depoliticize the issue of climate change. And maybe I'm too ambitious to believe that, but it has happened in American politics in the past. You'll remember, Walter, when missile defense was the most political issue between the parties just a few decades ago, and it's no longer a political issue. And, Democrats were against missile defense. They said it wasn't possible, it wasn't scientific. That wasn't too long ago. And Reagan went forth, they dubbed it, the critics, Star Wars. Now, no one uses that term. It's back to missile defense. I hope that in the second Trump term, we shed the politics of the old Star Wars and get to just climate change.
Okay. I'm asking you now really, I guess, to put on a prophet's mantle here or look into your crystal ball. Do you think your associate Rick Grinnell would be playing a role in a second Trump term foreign policy? He was ambassador to Germany. He was involved in the negotiations with Serbia and Kosovo, and now he seems to be at the Carnegie Mellon Center, while maybe also playing a role in the election campaign.
I do. I haven't asked him. I'm too much of a diplomat to ask him what he's planning to do, but I do know that the president really values his judgment and is beyond pleased with what he did with Kosovo and Serbia. And so I think he will be a key player in a second Trump term, whether he wants to or not. Once you get on the outside and you start resting and having a bit of fun, it's hard to go back, but I think he will be called back. That's my sense. But again, I have no insider information to share.
And finally, for the students who are watching, what advice would you give students based on your experience and what you've seen in academia, in think tanks, and in foreign policy, in government? How should a young person who really wants to be involved in this and have a career in this, what should they do at school? What should they be thinking about? What would you tell the 21-year-old you?
Oh God, I wish I could go back and fix her. That would be a great thing. Life would be so much easier for me now. But the thing that I would say the most is that character matters. And people don't think that it matters now because you can move up faster if you cut corners, if you hurt other people, if you advance at the expense of other people, it will all catch up to you and it will ultimately defeat you. But you see so many people around you, above you and alongside of you, cutting corners, doing deals. Stay out of it. And it will surprise you what happens because those above you, even if they're caught up in the politics of the moment, recognize character and stands out. And what I mean by that is you don't have to compromise your views. You don't have to be, speak up and scream at the top of your lungs all the time, but sometimes you have to do it. But your character will matter. It will even matter more when it comes alongside preparation and hard work. And hard work becomes genius. And I remember someone telling me that very early. Genius comes down to who's willing to work the hardest. How many people were so smart, but just didn't put the work in? And then you never hear from them. But that combination of character, strong character, and hard work is a winning combination, even in Washington. I had my own mishap in the at the State Department that led to me leaving before I was actually ready to go. And it was, in some ways, the most eye-opening experience of my professional career because people that I had worked with, very senior people, some of whom had been Secretary of State, and whom I'd worked for and worked with since my 20s, they showed up. And I realized people watch you even when you think they're not watching you. And to have them show up at my first, kind of public stumble was so amazing to me and so gratifying. So don't let people compromise you because they're willing to do it. And Washington, I know this is a global audience, but Washington is now no longer just the capital of the US. It is a global hub itself. Washington has a couple of good values that people don't always recognize. The town has a long memory and it values loyalty. So remember those things.
Great. Well, thank you so much for joining us, and I really appreciate it. We will have this webinar up on our site, and I'm sure we're going to have a lot of people watching it. And I am always interested in what you have to say, Karen. I look forward to once we get back to being able to have cocktail parties and things. Maybe you'll be back over here again.
I look forward to it. That will be a great evening.
All right. Well, thank you very much. And thanks to the students and faculty at the Open Society University Network and at Bard. And I will be seeing you again with a talk about the Biden administration before too much longer, should there be a Biden administration. Take care.
Bye.